Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. As you heard, my name's Aaron. I'm with Terracon. I am based in our corporate headquarters in Kansas City. The reason I mentioned that at the outset, nothing to do with what happened last night. It didn't hurt. Nothing with, but the reason I mentioned that actually is because Kansas City is the location of one of the worst construction and engineering related disasters of the 20th century. I'm referring, of course, to the Hyatt Skywalk collapse. So quick show of hands. Who here is familiar with the Hyatt Skywalk collapse? Okay. That's what I would hope to see in a room full of engineers, even though it's been 40 years since that happened. And I will tell you, the rest of the world has moved on, but the people of Kansas City have not. The Hyatt Skywalk collapse is still part of our shared collective history. People still talk about it to this day. The building's still there. I've been in it countless times, and every time I walk through the door, I can't help but look up. So I mention this because Miami has now had two very, very significant, tragic events in very short order. Both the FIU bridge collapse that we're going to talk about today, and then, of course, the Champlain Towers collapse in Surfside. And so Miami is going to be living with the pain of this tragedy for decades to come. And the rest of the world is going to move on. But it's my hope, and it's quite frankly the reason why I'm here today, that we as part of the engineering community, that we don't move on, that we keep talking about these things, that we learn from them, and then hopefully we don't repeat them. So let's talk about this project. But actually, you know what, before we do, I have two quick disclaimers, because of course I do, I'm a lawyer. And the first one's that I'm a lawyer. I'm not an engineer. This is not a presentation on how to design a better bridge. I don't have the skill set for that. This is a presentation on ethics, which again, I realize as a lawyer, may be a little suspect, but I ask that you bear with me nonetheless. So the second disclaimer is that Terracon did not have any involvement in this project. Now, I don't say that to distance myself from it. I say that simply to let you know that I'm not revealing any client confidences or anything like that, because I don't have any privileged information. Everything we're going to talk about today either came from publicly available sources or it's my opinion. And when it's my opinion, I'm going to work very, very hard to let you know that it is just my opinion, and take it for whatever it's worth. Agree with me, disagree with me, draw your own conclusions. So now let's go ahead and get into it. There we go. So this was a $12 million project. This is a pedestrian bridge, and the intent of the bridge was to connect a residential neighborhood on one side of a busy road and a canal to the university campus. And the impetus for this bridge, it actually came from a place of safety, or I suppose more appropriately, it came from a place of tragedy. There was a student a number of years before who was making his way to class, and he had to cross a busy road to get to the campus, and he was unfortunately struck and killed by an automobile. And so that got the university thinking, how can we safely get our students from where they live to where they learn and then back home again? And this bridge was part of that solution. And it was funded with money from the Florida DOT. So you have the university and FDOT working as sort of co-owners, if you will, for this project. And together, they put this out for bid on a design build basis. And they selected their team, and that team consisted of a company called Mann Construction Management, or MCM. They were the general contractor and the design builder for the project. MCM in turn hired FIG as the prime designer and the structural engineer of record. FIG in turn hired Louis Berger. Louis Berger did the peer review for the design. And then you have a firm called Bolton Perez and Associates. They're the CEI firm. They were doing inspections, and they were doing their inspections under contract with the university and FDOT. They were working for those co-owners. That's going to be an important fact in probably about 17 minutes. So just sort of file that away. Bolton Perez working directly for the owner. And they came up with this design. They came up with this design for this bridge, a design that the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, when they put out their report, they said that this was a unique design. They said this was a highly complex design. They said that they could not find another bridge anywhere else in the world that looks like this bridge. And the fact of the matter is, it is a unique design. It is a highly complex design. And I'm going to trust the NTSB when they say they couldn't find another bridge anywhere else in the world that looks like this. But what this bridge is not a cable-stayed bridge. It was intended to look like a cable-stayed bridge, but really, this was a truss bridge. All the support for the bridge came from a single concrete truss running down the center of the deck. Everything you see above the roof and the deck there, that tall pylon, those steel elements that are coming down, all of that is aesthetic. There was no structural support that came from those elements. And the fact of the matter is, my opinion, I believe the university wanted a signature piece. I think they wanted something to grab the attention of people who were driving down Southwest 8th Street. And they look up and they say, "What is that?" I said, "Oh, that's Florida International University." I said, "Oh, that's a cool looking bridge." Because it was. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, keep in mind, but it was a unique design. It was a highly complex design. And it was going to be constructed in 8 different stages. Today, we're going to talk about stage 3, because unfortunately, that's only as far as construction proceeded, and that is the erection of the main span. And the manner in which it was constructed, the bridge was constructed using what's known as the accelerated bridge construction, or the ABC method. This is a very common method of constructing bridges, and the idea behind the ABC method, if you're not familiar with it, is that essentially you cast pieces of the bridge off-site, you bring them into place at the last minute, and then hook them up. Again, not an engineer, but you essentially hook them up. And what that allows you to do is minimize disruption to traffic. So even at the outset of this project, there was a focus on minimizing the disruption to traffic. And again, I'm not saying that's a good thing, a bad thing, or otherwise, it just is. So on March 10th, 2018, you can see a picture here of the main span being brought into place. Now, this was a big day for the project. This was a celebratory day. There were 6 PEs from FIG who were there to watch this first very, very large piece of the bridge, seeing this project really kind of come into focus. The president of the company, the president of FIG, she was there that day giving interviews to news cameras on the street. So again, there was a celebratory mood as this was happening. And they brought in this main span. They set it down on the pier on one side, the pylon on the other. They inspected it. Everything looked good. So they removed the bracing, and shortly thereafter, they reopened the road to traffic. That afternoon, per the design, there were 2 of the diagonals, number 2, which you can see on the far left, number 11, which is highlighted on the far right. Well, all of these diagonals, all these truss members had post-tension cables within them. But the design called for the post-tension cables within 2 and 11 to be de-stressed once that span is in place, once it's supporting its own weight. So a company called VSL, they came out, they did that work, they de-stressed number 2, no issues. They de-stressed number 11, and then cracks started to appear. Or in the words of the technician who was doing the work, he said, "It cracked like hell." That's a screenshot from his cell phone. He took these pictures, he sent it to his supervisor, and he said it cracked like hell. Span's been in place now for a couple of hours. And again, traffic is flowing underneath the bridge. Over the next day, some more cracks start to appear, all in that area between where that connection of the diagonal number 11, the vertical number 12, and the deck of the bridge. An MCM takes pictures of these, sends them to the structural engineer of record, and says, "We need you to comment on this as quickly as possible." Unfortunately, that email did not get opened until the next morning. But the next morning, the structural engineer of record opens the email. He responds He says they need to put in plastic shims right away, but that no jacking is required. And he says, we do not see this as a safety issue. Now, my guess, my assumption, my opinion, my guess is when people got that email and they saw the structural engineer of record saying, we don't see this as a safety issue, they probably did one of these and exhaled and said, okay, structural engineer of record says it's not a safety issue. What do we need to do now to fix the problem? Later on that same day, the structural engineer of record leaves a voicemail for his counterpart at FDOT and says, he's talking about the cracking. He says, but we don't see that there's any safety issue there, so we're not concerned about it from that perspective. That evening, he sends an email to the project team and says, we've evaluated further and confirmed this is not a safety issue. But meanwhile, the decision is made that they're going to re-stress those post-tension cables in diagonal number 11. Now, this was not part of the design. And when asked about it, FIG basically said, we're taking a step back. We wanted to put the project basically one step back and see how it performed. The NTSB was very critical of this decision because they said this was not subject to peer review. This is not part of the original design. Nevertheless, on the day, the decision is made that they're going to re-stress those post-tension cables. And the company who is doing that, VSL, they can't get out there until the 15th. So they scheduled that work on March 13th. Meanwhile, the cracks are continuing to grow. And again, this is all in that area between the diagonal number 11, the vertical 12, and the deck of the bridge. And so keep in mind, you have Bolton Perez, the inspections firm, they're out there. They're measuring these cracks, they're photographing these cracks. MCM is out there. Everyone is documenting this, and all the while, traffic's continuing to flow under the bridge. So finally, on March 14th, MCM says, enough's enough. So we have to have a meeting. We have to figure out what is going on. We want everybody to come together. We're going to meet at the project trailer. We want to hear from the structural engineer of record what is happening with these cracks. So they call that meeting for the next day, for March 15th. And meanwhile, on the 14th, FIG, the structural engineer, the prime designer, they spend their day preparing their presentation for the next day. And again, VSL is scheduled also to come out on the 15th to do their post-tensioning work. So that day comes. That morning, you have two engineers from FIG, including the engineer of record. They go out, they walk the span, they're seeing these cracks for the first time in person. And they're being told that the cracks have grown. So at 9 o'clock, they have their meeting, and everybody's there. The university's there, FDOT's there, Bolton Perez is there, MCM is there, FIG, of course, is there. And the presentation from the structural engineer of record, he gets up, he gives his presentation, and he says that the cracks look more significant in person, but that he has no safety concerns. He says it's a temporary loading condition and that he cannot replicate it by his own engineering analysis. Meanwhile, during that meeting, no one who was present expressed any concern with the safety of the span. No one recommended that they close the road to traffic because perhaps 100 yards away from where they're having that meeting in the trailer, traffic is continuing to flow under the bridge. And meanwhile, VSL now is on site, they've mobilized, and they're starting their work. Which takes us to 1:46 p.m. on the 15th. Now, I want to be very clear about something. I don't show that video to be gratuitous. I don't show it to sensationalize what happened. I hate watching that video. I've seen it probably upwards of 100 times. And every time my stomach drops because I know what's going to happen. And I know that no one in that video knows. The reason I show it is because that's what happened. That is the truest, most accurate representation of what happened on the day. And so, I have this diagram here, and you can see kind of the mechanics of the failure, and you can see that there was a blowout of concrete right at that connection that we've been looking at between 11 and 12 and the deck. And once that truss member failed, the bridge lost its support and it fell to the ground. All of those things are true. But what's missing from these pictures? Cars, technicians from VSL. These pictures are a little too sterile. And so that's why I show that video, awful as it is to watch. Because in that moment, 6 people were killed. There were 5 motorists and 1 technician from VSL who were killed in that moment. And another 10 people were injured. 5 workers, including 1 worker from VSL who's permanently disabled. You saw a screenshot of his cell phone earlier. Additionally, another 5 motorists were injured. All of those individuals and their families, their lives were forever changed because of that moment. And that's the personal impact. That's the very, very real impact of what happened. We're going to talk about the professional impact next. And I want to make it very clear, there's no comparison. There's no comparison between a family losing one of their loved ones and a firm having brand reputation. Nevertheless, because we are part of this profession, we are going to talk about the professional impact as well. And that professional impact largely came in the form of lawsuits from victims. You had 2 government investigations. You had a PE board investigation, and then reputational harm for each of these firms. And we're going to take these in turn. The lawsuits actually went pretty quickly. And the reason for that is because this is not a lawsuit that you really want to be a part of, and it's not really something that you want to spend a lot of time trying to defend your work, even if your work isn't necessarily to blame. If you're part of this project and 6 people died, you're going to look to settle. And that's what happened. Collectively, 25 different parties who were part of this project came together and paid a total of $103 million to the families of the victims. Additionally, another $9.5 million was repaid to FIU because essentially they did not get the bridge that they paid for. Everyone who was involved in the project, with one exception, took part in that settlement. And the one exception was Lewis Berger, the peer review firm. And we're going to talk about in a little bit why, in my opinion, why they decided not to take part in this settlement. But they went their own way. And the lawsuits continued against them for a while, up until about, until January of 2022. So of that $103 million, we don't know who paid what exactly. That is, those settlements are confidential. The only reason we know the total is because it actually came out in a bankruptcy filing of one of the parties. What we can assume, what is my best guess, is that because this was ultimately found to be a design flaw, and it was, that the design team presumably paid policy limits to resolve the cases against them. Now, as I said, there were 2 government investigations. There was one from OSHA and there was one from the NTSB. The NTSB had a hearing on this, and if you're interested in this, it's online. You can watch it on YouTube. And it starts with the chairman of the NTSB saying the bridge was talking to them. It wasn't just talking, it was screaming that there was something definitely wrong with the bridge, yet no one was listening. It's not a great way to start a government hearing, and it did not go well for them from there. because they did find that there was a design error as the primary cause of the collapse. Additionally, they cited the peer review firm, Lewis Berger, for failing to include the staging design in their work. But they cited everyone for failing to stop the work, failing to close the road. With regard to the peer review, 1 second here. Sorry about that. With regard to the design flaw, the NTSB determined that the design underestimated the loads at that connection between 11 and 12 at the deck, that area that we've been looking at where all the cracking was occurring. And the design overestimated the capacity to resist shear because of the incorrect load requirements. Also, they found that there was a lack of redundancy in the design. And so if you think about your average truss bridge, number one, it's probably not made of concrete to begin with. That's not to say that it can't be, but more often than not, a truss bridge is probably going to be made of steel. And more often than not, with your average truss bridge, if you look at those truss members, if you look at the triangles that are formed, those triangles are usually, if not identical, there's usually some symmetry there. In this case, you didn't have that. You know, to keep that look of a cable-stayed bridge, you had the truss members at all different angles, all different lengths to kind of complete that look. But again, if you think about your average truss bridge, there's probably a truss on either side of the deck, usually tied in together. Well, this had a single truss running down the center of the deck. And the NTSB cited the design for a lack of redundancy. FIG tried to argue that because there were multiple post-tension cables within each truss member, that gave them some redundancy. And the NTSB said that doesn't work. And they said, and we know it doesn't work because once that single truss member, number 11, once it failed, the bridge failed. So they were cited for a lack of redundancy as well. With regard to Bolton Perez, the CEI firm, they were cited by both OSHA and the NTSB for not stopping the work, for not exercising their own independent engineering judgment. OSHA pointed to their contract and said, you have a requirement in your contract to exercise that independent professional judgment. And the NTSB went a step further. The NTSB said, because you are working for FDOT, you, Bolton Perez, have an obligation to go out and close the road unilaterally. You are an extension of FDOT. You should have closed the road. I don't know that I've ever come across a CEI firm unilaterally closing a road. But nevertheless, that was the NTSB's determination because they were working directly for FDOT, even though FDOT did not express any interest in closing the road. Bolton Perez should have. And they were cited for that. With regard to Lewis Berger, the peer review firm, they were also cited. And they were cited for not doing a comprehensive peer review, not looking at all of those 8 stages of design. And the response that Lewis Berger gave was, you're absolutely right, we did not do that because we were not hired to do that. I have a quote here from the engineer who worked on this, and he said, in the beginning, I suggested to do this kind of analysis to analyze the connections. I'm talking about the nodes or the joints to analyze the connections. However, the budget and time to do this actually was not agreed upon with the designer. So who hasn't been in that situation before? Where you tell your client, look, I want to do this. This is going to give you the best finished product. And the client says, well, I only have the time and money for this. And they said, okay, to do that, it'll be $110,000. And the response was, will you do it for 60? And they said, yes. So in the end, Lewis Berger was paid $60,000 to do a peer review of just the final in-place design. The problem here is that FDOT regulations require a comprehensive design, or excuse me, a comprehensive peer review to look at all of the stages. And so at the end of the day, Lewis Berger was cited for not doing the work that they weren't hired to do. With regard to the PE board, shortly after the collapse, this statement went up on the Florida Board of Professional Engineers website. And essentially what it says is, we know this happened. We know there was a collapse. We know there are 2 government investigations looking into it. And if it is found that there is a design error, that is the cause of the collapse, we will take all appropriate steps. So those investigations concluded. They did find that there was a design error. What happened next kind of happens behind closed doors. You don't really get to hear a lot about how PE boards run their investigations, what they look at. And sometimes you kind of have to read between the lines and you can only see the outcome. And in this case, the outcome is that the structural engineer of record voluntarily relinquished his license in 2021. Now, I think for anyone in this room who is a PE, I think you know how hard it is to get that license. And at least in my world, also as a licensed professional, I know that it's been my experience that people do not voluntarily relinquish their license unless they know someone's going to take it from them. So nevertheless, structural engineer of record voluntarily relinquished his license in 2021. And for all these firms that were involved in this project, there has been reputational harm. MCM went bankrupt. They have now rebranded themselves as Magnum Construction Management, or what I call MCM 2.0. But the original version of MCM went bankrupt. And FIG, Bolton Perez, Lewis Berger, they are all tied to this project. So if you're looking on Google and you type in, FIG, you're going to get FIG FIU bridge collapse, Bolton Perez FIU bridge collapse. These firms are forever tied to this project. And I'm not saying this is good, bad, or otherwise. Again, it just is. And then, of course, you have the individual PE who is forever tied to this project. That reputational harm will continue for years to come. But there's actually some continuing fallout. So after the first round of lawsuits with the families of the victims, once those wrapped up, there was another round of lawsuits. And MCM sued Lewis Berger. And they actually sued WSP, who bought Lewis Berger after the collapse. So WSP had no connection to this project whatsoever. But they acquired Lewis Berger after. And MCM sued them both, basically saying that the $9.5 million that they had to repay the university, that really should come from Lewis Berger and WSP as the peer review firm. And I have a quote here from the president of MCM who says, "We saw the concern. Every day they documented it. We were assured by a world-renowned designer that it wasn't a safety concern." Now, I have a couple of problems with that statement. Number one, yes, it's true. They were assured by a world-renowned designer that it wasn't a problem, but that wasn't Lewis Berger. That was FIG. Lewis Berger had no part in these conversations whatsoever. The other part I have, and this is probably just more a personal gripe than anything else, is the fact that they're the design builder. They own all of this project, and yet they're very, very quick to try to blame this on the designer. I do have a problem with that. That lawsuit went on for about 9 months, and it was settled, I believe, in late 2022. And for terms I don't know, unfortunately, it's confidential. But with regard to Lewis Berger, if you remember, I said the lawsuits from the families of the victims. So Lewis Berger went their own way, and I can't sit here and tell you exactly why, but I can guess that they're looking at this saying we are the farthest removed as the peer review firm. We're the farthest removed from anything that happened on that project site. And we're going to try and go our own way, and we're going to make these families prove their cases against us. I could see someone being talked into that. And they did that for a while. And as they started to get closer to trial, things started to change and they started to go very badly for them, quite frankly, because the judge in one of those cases made a determination that when it came time to present this case to the jury, they were going to let the jury decide whether or not to award punitive damages. And I'll tell you a couple things about punitive damages. Number one, and this is going to be really obvious, but they're intended to be punitive. You don't look at the harm that's caused. You don't look at the damage. You look at, more often than not, you look at the profits of the company and you take a percentage of that. It is intended to really, really hurt. The other thing about punitive damages is that they are rarely covered by your insurance, because to have punitive damages, you basically have to be grossly negligent. And an insurer is not going to insure gross negligence. They're going to insure common negligence. So Lewis Berger is looking at this saying, we are facing potentially a very, very massive damage award that may not even be covered by our insurance. And so they settled. And you can see here, this is a quote from the lawyer for the family who says, Lewis Berger should be punished, not just with compensatory damages, but with punitive damages. So no other out-of-town engineering firm comes in and does a half-assed peer review that endangered lives. Now, I'm a defense lawyer by trade. That is a very plaintiff's lawyer thing to say. But the fact of the matter is it carried the day, and the judge agreed and allowed the jury to determine whether or not to award punitive damages. And so they settled. But for all of the project participants, I don't think anyone has been more affected than FIG. And shortly after the NTSB's report came out, FIG was pulled from 2 Texas DOT projects, 2 very high-profile projects. And Texas DOT made it very clear why they were replacing them. And they essentially said this is because of the FIU bridge collapse and because of the NTSB's findings. Additionally, FIG was hit with a 10-year debarment from the Federal Highway Administration, FIG and the structural engineer of record individually. Now, if you're not familiar with that term debarment, essentially what that means is FIG cannot take any, they cannot participate in a job that involves federal money. And this is a firm that specializes in bridges. Not a lot of private bridge work out there, quite frankly. And the president of the company has said that if they cannot get this debarment overturned, and they've not been able to so far, that it could very well be the end of FIG. And again, I'm not saying that's good, bad, or otherwise. I'm just saying it is. Meanwhile, the university still wants its bridge. And so this rendering came out a few months ago. It shows what the new design is going to look like. And there are going to be some changes. It's going to be constructed out of steel, and the road's going to be closed during construction. So it does appear there have been some lessons learned. Now, this is the part where we get a little bit of audience participation. I have a question, and I'm asking for a show of hands. Bolton Perez, so the CEI firm, working directly for FDOT and the university, they were cited for not stopping work. Who thinks it was appropriate? Who agrees with the fact that Bolton Perez was cited for not stopping the work? Show of hands. Okay. Who does not agree with that? Who thinks they should not have been cited? Would you mind sharing your thoughts? We have a microphone here.
I'm not totally familiar with the CEI term, but it's me that they were an inspector. They didn't have authority to shut the job down. That's the way I see it. Maybe their responsibility may be greater than that, but the way I see it, they inspected and reported. They do not have that authority.
And so I would agree with that. Their role is to inspect, it's to inform, it's to pass that information up to what I think are commonly referred to as the decision makers. And I think in this case, the issue that really was kind of the turning point was the fact that they had professional licensed engineers involved in this work. And the determination is every engineer has their own independent obligation to protect the safety of the public. And so in this case, they said that Bolton Perez did not do that. And so even if you have the structural engineer of record, the bridge designer who is the person who should be making the determination, they said, nevertheless, as an engineer, you have your own independent obligation to protect the public, and that's why they cited them. Looking at Lewis Berger, the peer review firm, who, as I said, was cited for doing the work they weren't hired to do. Cited for not doing the work they weren't hired to do. Who thinks it's appropriate that they were cited? Who thinks it was not appropriate? Thinks it was wrong? Sir, would you mind sharing your thoughts?
Again, their contract only had them looking at a certain portion of peer review. So, I mean, that's a tough one. It really is.
And you're absolutely right. Their contract. I've got one more over here, please. Their contract was very, very clear. They were only supposed to look at the final in-place design. You're absolutely right about that. Please.
If consultant engineers can be held liable for work they were not scoped to do, then none of us in this room can really logically maintain our business, nor can we obtain insurance. It is not a sustainable environment.
I appreciate you sharing that. And here's kind of the critical piece. And we've got one more in the back there as well, please. Okay. Oh, fantastic. I'll take a break.
Well, they knew that they should have done that review. And they had an option. And that option was to decline the contract.
Okay, and I'm trying to remember some years back, the Texas Engineering Board came up with something in their regulations to us professional engineers that even if you were not paid for a particular part of the scope of a project, like say you designed it, but you didn't do the construction management, you still had an obligation to check on that project periodically because you were involved in the design. Now, I don't know if anybody wants to say anything on that, but I'm not saying that means you're responsible for everything in the whole world, but there's some responsibility there if your part was part of the big picture.
Yeah, and I would say, so this is kind of a messy one, because the decision that was made was based on the idea that this is an FDOT project, and if you're taking FDOT money, even for a limited scope, you have an obligation to do everything that FDOT requires. Now, it does not appear that anyone involved in this project really understood that. And I would go so far as to lump FDOT into that, because at one point, FIG actually wanted to do the peer review in-house. They wanted to send it to a different office. And FDOT said, no, you can't do that. You got to send it to a different firm. They have to use a different system. But there was no discussion about the scope of that peer review. So they were sort of halfway in that discussion and not all the way in. But nevertheless, I think this really comes down to the idea of ignorance of the law is no excuse. And if you are taking state money for a project, I think it's incumbent upon everyone to understand what strings are attached to that. And to the point that was made in the back, if the client's not willing to hire you for that, then the only thing you can do in that situation is walk away. And I've given this presentation a number of times, and we've gone down many different rabbit holes about can you contract around this and things like that. The fact of the matter is, the only way Lewis Berger could have protected themselves in this situation is either to do everything or to do nothing at all. And that's ultimately where the decision came down. One last question, because I realize we're short on time. Who should have closed the road? Just yell it out. Okay. I'm hearing a lot of everybody's, a few anybody's. Here's what I'll say. I have to imagine if I had an opportunity to sit down with somebody who was in that trailer and say, look, there are no lawyers here, no one's recording anything. Do you wish you would have done more? I have to think the answer is yes. I have to. So that's what I want to leave you with. And that's what I want all of you to take back to your firms. Look for those opportunities. Look for those opportunities to protect the public first and foremost. But look for those opportunities where it's going to be uncomfortable to stand up and say, Mr. Structural Engineer, I disagree. I think there are ways that can be done diplomatically, but I think it's difficult nonetheless. That takes a whole lot of courage. But as licensed professionals, that is what is required to protect the safety of the public. So I want to say thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.